that. Oops, they take off to the south. All right. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi-hahiroth between Migdol and the sea. So not only did they go south, but they went south down the western side of the sea. Now, I considered putting a map up here, but I was afraid that if I put up a map, it would launch us into the dead-end discussion about where did they cross the Red Sea and what does exactly Red Sea mean, because it translates a Hebrew phrase that means Reed Sea. And was it part of the arm of the Red Sea, or was it the Bitter Lakes just north of the Red Sea? And don't know. And at risk of sounding a little bit cavalier, don't care. It's a miracle. It was a substantial body of water, and they were led down the western side. They could have gone east a little bit into the desert and then turned south, and they would have avoided the sea altogether. But not only does the Lord take them south, He takes them south into a very strategically poor location. In front of Baal-zephon, you shall encamp facing it, facing the sea, by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. In other words, when Pharaoh sees their path, he's going to go, those poor idiots are lost. I mean, wherever they're going, they shouldn't be going there. This is a golden opportunity. They have trapped themselves next to the sea. And God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. Here it is again. We looked at the 19 occurrences of this last time. Well, here's number 20. I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. And the people of Israel said, yes, sir. And they did so. God has rescued Israel, who've been in the land for 430 years. That is, they have been in Egypt since, going back in American history, since before Jamestown. All right? That is a long, long time. Hey, guys. Josh, good to see you guys, man. Welcome back. And after 430 years, the Lord has shown His strong right arm and has rescued them out of the land. And now He leads them into a trap, and it's clearly on purpose. He's put them there and put them in peril, and it's a divine plan. And so the first question this morning is, why would God intentionally put His people in harm's way? Why would God intentionally put His people in harm's way? Steve. He says that in the text, doesn't it? I will get my glory on Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Good. Judy. To build their faith. We will see that later in the text. Yeah, that's going to be the effect. Good. Oops, wrong button. Oh, there we go. Does God still allow things in our lives to test our faith? Yeah, every day. Every day. And we are inclined to sometimes say, well, if I hadn't taken that road, then I wouldn't have gotten in that accident. I wouldn't be missing this work, and it wouldn't be costing this much money. Why did the Lord let me do that? If I had that conversation, I wouldn't have offended that person, and I wouldn't have had to write 47 emails to get it fixed the last 3 days. Why did the Lord let me do that? I have a relative. I hate to use this illustration, but it's pretty good, who after 41 years of marriage will happily tell you that I've had a miserable life because God let me marry the wrong person. He doesn't even say it's all her fault. He says it's all his fault. And it's like, maybe you should be thinking about this differently. Maybe you should be loving your wife, and maybe you should be loving God, and maybe you should be learning from your trials. Maybe there's a purpose here. Now, it's not a perfect illustration because I wouldn't compare this relative to somebody who's been led down into the desert facing the sea. But we are all put in circumstances regularly by God so that He can get glory and so that we can get faith. And that's where the Israelites are. Any other thoughts on those first 4 verses? Remember, south, away from the goal, slightly west. The further south they go, the worse it's going to get. Why in the world do we go in that direction? And he uses that wrong direction and entrapment to encourage Pharaoh to chase them. I mean, the impression is that Pharaoh, if they had taken off into the desert and disappeared into the Sinai, he might have thought it wasn't worth the trouble, but there they are. It's like a plum ripe for picking. All right, so let's pick up the reading. Verses 5 through 9. When the king of Egypt was told, this is evidence for what I just said, that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people, and they said, "What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" Now, this is after 1.5 years of plagues that have wrecked the country, right? So he made ready his chariot and took his army with him, and took 600 chosen chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he pursued the people of Israel while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and his horsemen and his army. Let me just insert here that if we are right in the reconstruction of Egyptian history relative to these events, this Pharaoh is a guy by the name of Thutmose III, 18th dynasty. And according to the Egyptologists, he's probably the second most powerful Pharaoh in all of Egypt's history. That is, Thutmose III had an impressive resume for conquest in all directions, one of the more powerful armies. There's a guy in the next century who might beat him out by a little bit. But, I mean, we're not talking a weak-kneed, obscure Pharaoh. Now, again, correlating chronologies and all that, we can't be dogmatic. But this is probably Thutmose III, who's not used to losing. And when it talks about him mustering his army, he's got an impressive army. And he overtook them, encamped by the sea. Now, why were they just sitting there encamped by the sea? If you are a believer, God overcame our hardened hearts. He softened us. He worked graciously. But he's never obligated to do so. And he lets Pharaoh be hard. And so that raises the second question. Why is it when it comes to spiritual things, many smart people act very stupidly? At this point, do you think Pharaoh should have known how powerful Yahweh is? You think? Last week we looked at the plagues. 10 times. Yahweh sends a supernatural plague that's inexplicable naturally. 10 times. He removes the plague. Or 9 times. He removes the plague. Mostly when Pharaoh says, "Please stop," and he stops. He ends by killing a member of every family in Egypt in one night. And now, days later, Pharaoh's like, they're trapped. There's nothing they're going to be able to do now. Seriously? Seriously? But the truth of the matter is, God shows common grace and does benefits and gives good gifts to sinner after sinner after sinner after sinner, unmistakable evidence of his presence. Oftentimes such sinners are in church week after week after week after week after week and hear 1,000 sermons. And it's impenetrable. That is, when it comes to spiritual things, intelligence, the ability to run a big country like Egypt, the ability to be a famous world conqueror, none of that really counts for anything, does it? I put questions up there, and then I started talking. You following the gist of, this is inexplicable that Pharaoh could be this dense. But when it comes to spiritual things, unbelievers, the natural man does not discern the things of the Spirit of God. It never makes sense to them. People sometimes wonder about our rapture theology. The rapture is going to happen. And millions of us are going to be gone. And how in the world will the majority of people who have sat in church and have been heard about the rapture, if they didn't believe it, how will they not connect the dots and suddenly believe in Yahweh? Never works that way. If they don't believe Moses and the prophets, how will they believe if one rise from the dead? That is, physical evidence can always be explained away. Salvation is never a natural conclusion by an intelligent person. It's always a supernatural work overcoming our depravity. Yeah? You say, well, why are you emphasizing that? Because he has overcome our depravity. We have been given a great deliverance. Left to myself, I would be this spiritually stupid. And I'm using stupid in the precise sense of impenetrable to logic. I'm not using it in the loose sense that an 8-year-old calls his brother stupid. You know, I'm using it in the precise sense of somebody who doesn't matter how much evidence there is. Well, our text continues. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them. Bummer. And they feared greatly. Would you have? How much ability does this Israelite mob have of assembling an army and fighting the Egyptians? Like none? None? It's going to take them a long time before they are in fighting shape. They may be in good shape. They've been, making bricks, but they're not in fighting shape. They're not soldiers. They're not warriors. And so this is a legitimate fear, isn't it? You agree with me with this? This is reasonable fear. But now watch what they do with their fear. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. How do they do that? Well, poor Moses. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." All right, that is one possible response to these conditions. They have reasonable fear. What about their response? What does it indicate? Yes, ma'am. No, they are a long ways from trusting Yahweh. And once again, we are responsible to trust in all circumstances, but left to ourselves, we won't. I mean, this is about as irrational as Pharaoh. I mean, these people have been rescued from centuries in bondage. They have seen the plagues rain down on the Egyptians, and I didn't bring this out last week, but at least half a dozen of these plagues, it explicitly says in the text, but the flies were in Egypt, they were not in Goshen. And the darkness settled on Egypt, but they had light in Goshen. And Israel was exempted from this, and if they took the blood of a goat and sprinkled and put it on with the hyssop, their doorpost, the destroying angel passed over them. They have seen that with their own eyes. They have every reason to believe. And yet Pharaoh shows up and it's like, oh, bummer. We're going to die. And I didn't put the question up there. How often do we fail in our faith even though we have had abundant evidence that God will do what God says he will do? I guess that sounds rhetorical, but thank you, Steve. Feed in. Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah, next time, beat me about the head and neck. All right. You're exactly right. And Jesus in Matthew 6 gives us a whole series of reasons not to worry. I mean, he says, don't worry. God cares for the grass of the fields. He cares for the birds in the air. Are you not more valuable than they? Will your worry accomplish anything? Can you add 1 year to your life? Can you add 1 day to your life by worrying? No, pretty much not. Will worrying solve the problem that is in front of you right now? No. The fear here was legitimate, and I think sometimes we face difficult circumstances, and there will be a certain visceral response that says, oh no, what am I going to do? And what should that drive us to? Prayer and faith. Rather than, Lord, can we rewrite this script differently? I would prefer for us to do. So we read on. I love Moses' response. Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. I believe Moses gives us here a model of faith, and I base it on the next verse. Did Moses know how God was going to deliver Israel? Don't think so. In fact, the next verse we're going to read is God's going to say to Moses, what are you standing here for calling out to me? Go forward. And Moses is like, there's a sea there. We are standing here because there's a sea there. But before Moses knows how they're going to be delivered, Moses knows they're going to be delivered. He doesn't have to have, I'm going to do this, 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 and this. Moses doesn't know the future any better than the Israelites know the future. But Moses knows Yahweh. He knows what Yahweh has done over the last year and a half. He knows that Yahweh didn't do all of that to rescue them from Egypt only to destroy them at the hand of the Egyptians. He didn't send his son to die on the cross and rise from the dead and save us only to allow us to perish in our sins today. Only to allow our faith to be destroyed today. Whatever it is God allows in our life, he did not allow that in our life in order to undo what he's already done for us. Right? If we know Yahweh, then we know that whatever it is, whatever, and I don't mean to turn this into a big allegory, but whatever we're faced with that seems impenetrable, that seems unsolvable, it's part of a plan. And if you know Yahweh, you may not know how it's going to work out, and it may take the rest of our lives for it to work out, but we know he's got it under control. Now, God is going to clarify to Moses the way forward. When Moses says these words, there's no evidence in the text that he knows what the way forward is. So our faith, and I thought about taking us to a number of Psalms. There are a whole bunch of lament Psalms. You know that about 40% of the Psalms are laments. There are a whole bunch of lament Psalms in which the various psalmists, especially David, will for 12 verses say, Yahweh, how long? How long? My enemies are crushing me and my health is collapsing and I'm going to die. How long, Yahweh? And then at a key point in the psalm, it'll transition from fear to faith. And he'll say, I will praise the God of my salvation. In every case, the psalmist has not had his circumstances change in order to get to the point of faith. He's had his attitude change. That is, the process of lament is not the process of going from disease to disease-free. It's the process from disease with struggle to disease with victory. That's the process. That is, the work of giving us peace is never a work around us. It's always a work in us. Right? My wife just did a devotional for a ladies group on the peace of God in the upper room. And so I'm blessed for her to talk with me about her devotional for weeks while she's preparing it. And it struck me that it struck her, and then I got it mediated. At the beginning of the upper room discourse, Jesus says, "Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me." At the last verse of it, before his high priestly prayer is, "In the world you shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I have overcome the world." So the solution to our troublement, our struggle, is not in the world. The world's going to be messed up for our whole sojourn here. And if our peace comes from the outside, it will never be very peaceful. We will always be disrupted by the government and the economy and my boss and my work environment and my health and all the things. Those aren't going to be the source of the peace. The peace is this internal work on the basis of Christ overcoming the world. And these Israelites, Moses understood this, I think. The Israelites needed to learn it. Have you seen that in your own life? Have you seen the peace come before the circumstances change? Sometimes the circumstances never change. And sometimes the peace is a struggle. I will admit that. I don't know that we are guaranteed 100% peace till we get to heaven. But we grow into believing. Next text. Verse 15. The Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me?" That is, you should know me by now. "Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground." To me, this paragraph's kind of funny. I mean, I don't know that it was, the Hebrews would have laughed when they read it. But here they are, camped by this sea. And it's this big old body of water. We don't have any boats. And we got a couple million people. How many boats would it take? And God says, "Why did you ask me for advice? It's obvious what you should do. Just go that way. Oh, and by the way, when you stretch out your staff, the sea's going to open. You're going to walk through on dry ground, obviously." It's never happened before in the history of the world, but it's not a problem. It's not a problem. "And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, so that they shall go in after them. And I will get glory." There's that word. "I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, his chariots and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." So let me make an application. I think this is suggested by the text. God says, "Go forward," big old sea. And the people of Israel would, and Moses, would have justifiably said, "Can't. See there." And we are inclined to say "can't" when we are asked to do something that we think is above or beyond our abilities. Teach that Sunday school class. Sorry. Can't manage that. Share your faith with your neighbor. Sorry, can't manage that. Trust me with your work conflict. Yeah, but it's really conflicting. And it is absolutely true that God often commands us to do things that from our perspective seem to surpass our natural abilities. Doesn't he? He constantly asks us to do things that we legitimately can say, "Don't think I can do that." But "I can't" becomes lack of faith when God says do it. Because God's command comes with the implication of his power to obey. That if God says do this, he must intend to make it possible. He must intend to enable us to do it. Because we can't obey any of God's commands without his power, every time he commands us to do something, it implies his power to do it. It implies a posture of our hearts. That goes in a different direction. And that's a rebuke to me because I limit God by saying, that's not my gift. I'm shy, or I feel awkward about that, or I don't think I could do that, or I'm not going to volunteer for that. Or I limit God to what I can do. And God is constantly wanting to do things through people that they can't do, that only He can do, and that He enables. And people of faith that I've read about throughout church history and that I've met over the years do things you go, that's the last guy I would expect to do that. But they were willing, and God's power was evidenced. And that's how God can get glory when people do things that are beyond their natural ability. David Powlison, the great counseling guy, if you can read any books by David Powlison, I warmly recommend it. And Powlison said, it's curiously comforting to know that your calling is beyond your capacity. It's curiously comforting to know that your calling is beyond your capacity. Because when you're asked to do something beyond your ability, then it's comforting to know that therefore I must not have to do it. God's going to do it. A couple weeks ago, I was at a church and told the story of Eric Liddell, the Olympic runner. And Eric Liddell was one of the shyest people in his high school. He very, very meek personality. In fact, they were constantly trying to get him involved in school plays. And the only school play he was ever willing to do was Alice in Wonderland, and he played the Dormouse. And so they gave him the nickname Mouse, because he was just this retiring guy. Well, then he becomes an Olympic athlete, sets a world record and wins gold and bronze at the Paris Olympics. And everybody wants to hear him speak in front of huge crowds. And the first time they asked him to do it, now he actually learned this lesson before he won the Olympics, but he was already winning races galore. I mean, just winning races everywhere. He was super fast. And somebody said, hey, you've got a Christian testimony. You need to use your notoriety to share the gospel. I want you to speak at our student gathering. And Eric's like, I can't do that. I don't do that. I teach children Sunday school. There's no way I'm getting up in front of adults. And then he said, I prayed about it. And finally I decided, and I wish I could give you the exact quote. I don't have it with me. I finally decided that clearly I can't do this, so I'm just going to have to put it on Jesus. He said, so I just put it on him. And then I got up there, and Jesus did just fine. He spoke, and then he spoke again, and he spoke again, and he eventually got ordained to gospel ministry, and the Lord did things that Eric Liddell never believed he could do. He knew he could win races, speaking to a crowd. And how did God's plan, how did he plan to glorify himself in the situation among the Egyptians? Did you see the connection? I will glorify myself among the Egyptians, and they shall know that I am Yahweh. That he gained glory to himself. These Egyptians have been watching plague after plague after plague after plague, and some of them are pretty thick. And the surviving Egyptians said, all right, the doubt is all removed. And I think when we serve in ways that are inexplicably humanly speaking, God is getting glory to himself. Let me move on. A longer text, verses 21 to 31, because I want to get to chapter 15. But let's read this text together. This will be a few slides. Please watch carefully what happens. Here's what I'm going to ask after we read this text. In what ways does this event show clear signs of being a miraculous intervention? All right, in what ways? You say, well, you split a sea. Well, yeah, that would be one of them. Let's read. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And in the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and of cloud looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily. What would clog their chariot wheels? Mud would. Well, what did the Israelites go over on? Yeah, This is curious. And the Egyptians said, let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, upon their horsemen. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. So all this happened in one night. And the Egyptians fled into it, and the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. Notice that the Lord threw them into the midst of the sea. This is another function of the hardening. I mean, if you're Pharaoh and the Egyptians on the coast, watching the Israelites as they disappear in the distance across this body of water with the sea standing there, it at least has to cross your mind. I wonder if the water's going to stay that way. But God hardens the Egyptians, or at least their commanders, and he sends them into the midst of the sea. And the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen of all the host of Pharaoh. Now we know that Pharaoh survived this. He was Pharaoh for another couple of decades after this. He watched his army get drowned. That had followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. But the people of Israel, notice, third time we've read it, walked on dry ground through the sea. Third time we've read it, or second time. And the waters being a wall to them on the right hand and on the left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians. What had the Egyptians been doing to male Israelites right before Moses went down to Egypt? Throwing their baby males into the river. And the Egyptians had seen dead Israelites washing up on the shores. And Yahweh says, we're going to reverse this. Egypt is going to get what she deserves. And Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, and the people of Israel got it. So the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. So, what are the elements that show this is miraculous? Well, okay. I think if I asked this question down in the first and second grade class, they'd nail it. You got dry ground. This is a large body of water. The ground would be soaked. It spreads. If the ground remains muddy, and you're trying to take a couple of million people with all their cattle and wagons across that, it does not go well. And God hardened the ground for them. This is not a natural occurrence. It's a miraculous occurrence. He doesn't save halfway. The water's a wall on both sides. All right? So it's like the east wind just separates it in these walls of water. Never seen anything like that before. Now the next generation is going to get to see it again when they cross the Jordan. But nobody's ever seen this before. It's only happened twice in history. They got across pretty quick. I imagine they were moving along. Right? You know, if I were going through that wall of water, I would hustle. And they got across, but the Egyptians still could have caught them. Moving that kind of group across water like that would be incredibly difficult, and the Egyptians are an army. So what does God do? He gets the Egyptians down into the riverbed and sends them into a panic and muddifies the ground. Right? And suddenly they're getting clogged and stuck and scared. But he doesn't do it until they're far enough in that they ain't going to get out. Yes, ma'am, Jareen. I did skip a little bit. Yes, he did. He did. He gave them a respite. I did skip a few verses where the pillar of cloud and fire by night and cloud by day, when the Egyptians arrived, they could have attacked right away, and suddenly they couldn't because there was this barrier, and that gave them time to get into the river Get into the sea. But then the Lord lets the Egyptians say, oh, there they are. Let's get them. Yeah, it's all very designed. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yeah, and my point of all this is that we rarely are given inspired commentary on our lives where we see God doing all of this. But a book like Esther and a story like this is intended to teach us that there is an unseen hand, and He is getting us to glory through this veil of tears, through this path of wickedness, through this world that's against us. And someday, we're going to finally understand all the miracles that God was working to get us where we need to go. That there's nothing natural about it. Salvation is supernatural. Every day. Every day. And stories like this, where it becomes like Technicolor, we say, wow, look at what God did. And the rest of the Old Testament is going to say, yeah, that's what God does. He's a redeemer. And of course, Christ dying on the cross is a bigger miracle. And the Israelites got it. Many of them did. They saw, they feared, they believed. That's a good sequence. Now, how would you respond to an event like that in your life? Yes, ma'am. Praise and worship. Moses wrote a song. Now, I think Moses wrote it. It doesn't exactly say Moses wrote this song, but Moses is going to write one of the Psalms, and he's going to write a couple of more songs at the end of Deuteronomy. He's a songwriter. I think he wrote this. And this is called, in the New Testament, the Song of Moses. 15, 1 to 21. Now, I didn't put the entire text, but I want to give you just a sampling of it. Most of the song is a rehearsal of the destruction of the army of Pharaoh. But it begins, Moses and the people of Israel sang this song. That is, they get to the other shore, and they look back and see the enemy being drowned, and they're like, I think we should worship. I will sing to the Lord, for He has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider He has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song, and He has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise Him. My Father's God, and I will exalt Him. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is His name. And then after rehearsing the event, we come down to verse 11. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you? Majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders. And verse 13, you have led in your steadfast love the people whom you have redeemed. You have guided them by your strength to your holy abode. So what are the characteristics of this song? Very quickly. Number one, it is a God-focused song. The song itself is 18 verses, and by name or pronoun, God is referenced 49 times. That is, He's just singing about God. I mean, there's a lot of things you could sing about. You are free from slavery. Your personal experience might be worth it, but the main thrust is, look at what God is like. Yahweh is mentioned by name 11 times in this short hymn. When we think about what God has done for us, the result should be exulting in God for who God is. I would suggest that should be the heart of our hymnody, our worship music. It should be about God. Talk to God is the heart of this song. Verses 6 to 17 are, this is what God has done for me. I'm sorry, reverse. Thank you, Lord, for what you have done to me. Talk to God is the bulk of this. It's addressed directly to Him. But the beginning and end, verses 1 through 5 and 18, are written in third person about God, stirring others to worship. So our hymnody is both an expression of our love for God and a corporate expression where we're teaching others to love God for what he has done. His attributes are celebrated, and I've kind of absorbed our time by telling Olympic stories and whatnot. But if you went through this song, you would see his awesome power. Verses 2, 3, 6, 7, 10, 11, 12, 13, 16 are all references to his power and what he has done. 11 and 17 refer to his majestic holiness. He uses that exact expression, majestic holiness, his otherness. Verse 13 references his steadfast love. And verse 18, his supreme authority. He reigns over all. God delights in our getting to know him through his miraculous works. And as we get to know him, we celebrate him in our worship, in our music. Yahweh's mighty deeds are rehearsed. Thought about listing those. But they're the whole song. I mean, it's just the whole song celebrates this and this. And you did this, and you did this, and you did this, and you did this. And we're the beneficiaries. It is highly personal. In the first 3 verses, first-person pronouns are used 8 times. You are my God. You have given me salvation. You are my strength and my song. I will exalt him. In other words, sometimes there's an argument about Christian music. Should it be theological about God or should it be experiential about me? And what's the correct answer? Yes. And the ultimate example of this is the Psalms. You know, I jumped the gun here. Oh yeah, the Psalms are in my next slide. So I'll anticipate. But as we read the Psalter, you say, you know, there are people who criticize the person-centered focus of a lot of modern music, starting in about the Civil War forward. A lot of it is first person, I will, I will, I will. And there are those who say, we need to go back to the 18th century where it's all about God. Well, if you read the 18th century hymns carefully, you'll discover that the connection is what God has done to how I've experienced it. And so, the only bad hymn is a hymn that doesn't glorify God. But our experience is the connection to God. And the Psalms are full of first-person reflections on what God has done. And then you get to the end, verse 20. Then Miriam, Moses' sister, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a tambourine in her hand, and I don't know why we don't use a tambourine in our services, Pastor, right? Will you play it for us? Never. I withdraw the suggestion. All right. But she came with the tambourine, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and dancing, and Miriam sang to people of Israel, sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. Well, that's the beginning of the song. That's verse 1. So that simply says that these ladies led the people of Israel in corporate worship and singing, and they sang through this song of Moses, and it became their meditation as they walked through the wilderness. So it is corporate worship. It's okay for you to sing to the Lord in the shower at home, but sacred music is primarily for the purpose of our joining our hearts, because when I sing to the Lord, I get a blessing. When I sing with you to the Lord, I get a blessing plus. I get to worship God, and I get to enjoy you worshiping God. So this is the prototype, I think, for worship music. One of the reasons I say that is when you get to the book of Revelation 15, the saints are gathered in heaven, and they are singing the song of Moses and the Lamb, which is very interesting, because then it gives a little song, which is not quoted from this chapter or from any chapter in the Old Testament, but it's basically like, Moses taught us how to sing this kind of music, and now we're singing about the Lamb. I think that's what's going on there. So what role does music have in your worship? You say, well, I can't carry a tune in a bucket. I don't think we have to be good at singing for there to be a song in our hearts. Right? We can speak to ourselves. We can speak to one another in songs and hymns and spiritual songs, making melody from our hearts in a heartfelt way to the Lord. See the Psalms for the vast array of contexts and purposes for worshipful singing. Some of the songs are very much in a negative note. Some of the songs are very sad. Some of the songs are working through deep trial and deep discouragement and struggle. Many of the songs are written standing on the shore, looking at the Red Sea and wondering how we're going to survive. Some of the psalms are written right in the middle of the Red Sea, wondering how it's going to work out. And some of the psalms are written on the coast saying, wow, look at what God did. All of it is appropriate worship. All of it revolves around God and our relationship to Him. And the question I have for you is, has God done anything for you like He did for Israel that should put a song in our hearts? If God has miraculously delivered us, then we should be impelled to worship. Impelled to worship. I almost put compelled, but it shouldn't force us. It's just, we are impelled. We can't help it. We are incited to worship. And that's one of the reasons we've gathered here today. And at Christmas time, we are reminded of this miraculous deliverance, right? Any last thoughts? I had to rush through the music part. Chapter 15, read through that, meditate on it. It does. And the Hebrew there is literally, make a joyful noise translates one word that says, shout! Shout to the Lord! Yes, ma'am. Yes, we have. We are all redeemed, and let the redeemed of the Lord say so, whom He hath redeemed out of the hand of the enemy. Yes, ma'am. Amen. And that's a direct allusion to these events, isn't it? It sure is. All right, thank you. Let's close in prayer. Lord, thank you for the great deliverance you gave Israel and how it led to a song in their heart and on their lips. And I thank you for the great deliverance you've given us. If there's even one